Nora Vance had been asleep for nearly 2 hours when the plane jolted hard enough to spill the coffee 2 rows up. She woke instantly, the way she always did. Eyes open before her mind caught up. Body already scanning the cabin the way she'd been trained to scan a flight line at 0400 in a war zone. Seat 8A. Window seat. Nothing outside but a wall of gray cloud where the mountains should have been. She'd chosen this seat because it was quiet, because after 6 months of medical leave she wanted nothing more than to disappear into an aisle of strangers, and just be a passenger for once, not a call sign, not a name on a mission roster, just a woman going home. But the plane bucked again, harder this time. And somewhere behind her a child began to cry, and Nora felt the old readiness settle over her shoulders like a coat she'd never really taken off. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was tight, clipped, trying hard to sound calm and not quite managing it. "We've lost primary hydraulic pressure and our first officer has been incapacitated by turbulence. I need everyone to remain seated with your belts fastened. We are working the problem." A pause too long, filled with the low roar of engines straining against something the passengers couldn't see. Then, almost as an afterthought, the captain's voice cracked through again, quieter, more human. "If there is anyone on board with military flight experience, combat pilot experience, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The cabin went still in that particular way a crowd goes still when it realizes the danger is real and not theoretical. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the man beside her, Daniel, grip the armrest until his knuckles whitened. She had told him nothing about herself on this flight. Not that she'd flown F divided by a -18s off carrier decks in 2 deployments. Not that she'd logged more emergency procedures in actual combat than most instructors ever simulated. Not that the reason she was on leave was a mission that still visited her in her sleep some nights, though tonight, apparently, sleep had let her be. She had wanted for 3 hours to just be nobody. But nobody didn't exist anymore. Not when 140 people were about to find out exactly how thin the line was between controlled flight and catastrophe. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, her professional composure fraying at the edges, repeating the captain's request to rows that had nothing to offer her but frightened silence. Nora watched her come closer, watched the exhaustion and fear in the young woman's face, and felt the decision make itself before she'd consciously decided anything at all. She unclipped her belt. "I flew Hornets," she said, quiet enough that only the attendant and Daniel could hear. "Fleet Squadron. 2 combat deployments. I can help." The flight attendant's eyes went wide, then wet with something like relief, and she didn't ask for credentials or hesitate for even a second. There wasn't time for either. "Come with me. Please. Now." Daniel caught her wrist as she stood, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding, the arrow of realization pointing at a woman he'd sat beside for 3 hours without ever really seeing. "You're a pilot," he said, not a question. "A combat pilot." "I was," Nora said, and there was no vanity in it, no performance, just fact laid down like a card on a table. "Doesn't really go away." She walked forward through a cabin of faces turned toward her, some hopeful, some disbelieving that a woman her age with tired eyes and a ponytail coming loose could possibly be what the captain was asking for. She didn't blame them. She'd spent years proving herself to rooms full of men who looked at her exactly that way, and the proving had never once been about her ego. It had been about keeping people alive when everything else had failed. The cockpit door opened and she stepped into a world of alarms and red warning lights, into a captain with sweat on his brow and a co-pilot slumped against the far window, into a moment that would decide, in the next 20 minutes, whether any of them would see the ground again. The captain turned, saw her, and for one unguarded second his face showed something close to despair. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me you actually know what you're doing," he said, "because I am out of options. I flew combat sorties in aircraft designed to fail worse than this one," Nora said, sliding into the co-pilot's seat as two flight attendants gently moved the unconscious officer clear. Her voice had changed, dropped into something steady and low, the voice she used to use over a radio at 40,000 feet with someone shooting at her from the ground. "Talk to me. What do we have?" "Hydraulic failure, secondary systems compromised, we're flying on manual reversion and I can't hold altitude over these peaks," the captain said, hands white on the yoke. "I've got mountains on 3 sides and a ceiling dropping fast." Nora's eyes moved across the instrument panel the way they'd moved across 100 panels before, cataloging, calculating, already 3 steps ahead. "Then we're going to fly this thing the way you fly something that wants to kill you," she said. "Together. Right now." Outside the cockpit windows, the mountains waited, close enough now to see individual ridgelines cutting through the cloud, and somewhere behind her 140 strangers were praying to a God they hoped was listening, unaware that the answer to their prayers had been sleeping quietly in seat Ada the entire time. The yoke fought Nora's hands like something alive, sluggish and heavy without hydraulic assist, every control surface answering a full second late in a way that made the whole aircraft feel like it was moving through syrup instead of sky. She'd trained for this. Not this exact failure, not this exact aircraft, but the fundamental truth beneath it. That machines break and pilots have to become the redundancy the machine no longer has. "Cross-check your instruments with mine," she said to the captain, whose name she'd learned was Hale, a man 20 years her senior who was, in this moment, deferring to her with the kind of trust that only comes from genuinely having nowhere else to turn. "I need you flying attitude, I'll manage power and trim. We fly this like a carrier approach. Small inputs, patient corrections, never overcorrect." "Carrier approach," Hale repeated, disbelief and something like hope threading through his voice. "You've actually done this?" "More times than I can count, in worse weather than this with people shooting at me," Nora said, and meant it as reassurance rather than boast. "This is just weather. Weather doesn't hate you personally." She scanned the radar returns painting the mountains in hostile green and yellow, found what she was looking for, a valley corridor, wider than the others, running roughly along their present heading. "There. 20 degrees left of our nose. That's our lane through." Hale banked the aircraft with excruciating slowness, the controls answering like a wounded animal, and Nora felt the old cold clarity settle into her chest. The place her fear used to live before training had converted it into precision instead. Behind them in the cabin, Daniel had turned in his seat to watch the cockpit door, as if he could somehow see through it, as if watching hard enough could transmit courage forward to the woman he'd sat beside without ever knowing her name properly. The other passengers had gone quiet in the particular hush of people who understand at last that they are passengers in the truest sense, that their lives now rested entirely in hands they couldn't see. A little girl 3 rows back asked her mother if the plane was going to fall down, and the mother, without any real information to offer, said, "No, baby, there's a hero flying it now," because somehow that word had already traveled the length of the cabin, whispered seat to seat. "There's a pilot back there, a real one, a woman who flew fighter jets in the war." In the cockpit, the altimeter kept unspooling downward despite every correction, the mountain corridor narrowing as the ceiling dropped, and Nora felt the aircraft shudder as it clipped the edge of turbulence rolling off the ridgeline to their left. "Trim's fighting me," Hale said through his teeth. "We're losing the corridor." Nora's hands moved without conscious thought, adjusting power on the working engine, feeding in trim corrections in the exact rhythmic pattern she'd used 100 times, bringing a broken jet back to a pitching carrier deck in the black of night with no room at all for error. "You're not losing it," she said. "I've got the trim. You hold that attitude and trust it. This is exactly like a night trap. You don't fly the deck, you fly the numbers, and the numbers get you home." Hale exhaled, some of the raw panic draining out of his shoulders as he locked onto her steadiness like a lifeline, and the aircraft, impossibly, began to answer. The valley widened beneath them as they descended through the last ragged layer of cloud. and for one suspended moment the whole cockpit went silent except for the strained engines and the wind. And then ahead, unbelievably, the lights of a runway appeared, small and distant and precisely where Nora had known they would be. "There's our field," she said, and her voice, for the first time since she'd walked through that cockpit door, allowed itself the smallest thread of relief. "Gear check, flaps as she'll take them, and hail. Fly it exactly like you've flown 100 landings before. Because you have." The landing that followed was not gentle. It was hard and fast, and trailing sparks from a gear strut stressed past its limits. But it was a landing, wheels on concrete, the aircraft shuddering to a stop as emergency vehicles converged from every direction with lights strobing red and white across a cabin full of people who had just watched a stranger in seat 8A save every single one of their lives. The applause started somewhere near the back and rolled forward like a wave. Passengers standing on shaking legs to clap for a woman who slipped quietly back toward her seat, uncomfortable with the attention the way people who do genuinely brave things so often are. Daniel stood as she reached her row, and for a moment he simply looked at her. This stranger who had spent 3 hours beside him as a quiet woman with tired eyes, and was now being called a hero by exhausted, weeping passengers all around them. "Who are you?" he said, not really a question anymore, more an acknowledgement that the woman beside him had been more than she'd ever let on. "Nora Vance," she said simply, sitting back down in 8A as if nothing at all had happened, as if she hadn't just pulled 140 strangers back from the edge of a mountain. "I just wanted to get home." Outside the window, the real mountain stood exactly where they'd always been, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere far above them a woman who used to fly into war now closed her eyes again, finally, truly, allowed to rest. If this story moved you, if you felt your own heart in your throat somewhere over that mountain range, then hit subscribe right now, because The Hidden Nurse brings you another story like this one every single week. Ordinary people who turn out to be exactly the hero the moment required, and you will not want to miss what comes next.